You want to do a week-over-week comparison in Power BI? That got a lot easier with the offset function. I will show you how to do that. Week-over-week comparisons are quite a standard scenario in Power BI. And in general, what you want to do is you want to get your value of your current week and you want to compare it to the value of the previous week. Now, the question is, how do you get the value of the previous week? In general, when you take a look, usually let's focus, for example, on week number 14, and we have a specific value. And in this case, we just want to get the value of the previous week. In order to get the value of the previous week, we have to subtract 1 week. So from week 14 minus 1, we will get the value of week number 13. That's also a very common way to do it. We have just a little bit of difficulties when it's about the change of the years. So for example, if we have the first week of the year, January, and we want to get the value of the previous week, it's a little bit difficult because the value of the previous week is we cannot just do -1 because first of all, the year changes, and second of all, also the week itself changes. And a little more difficult is that some years have 52 weeks and some years 53. So we can also just not say if it's the first week, then just the previous week, replace it with a 52. We really have to get a plan how to do that. And there are many articles written about this and many smart people already thinking about that. Generally, there are solutions that work pretty well, but they are all kind of complex and complicated. There is an easier solution. As I already mentioned, we have now the offset function, and with the offset function, we do a little bit of a different approach. What the offset function is doing, it's in every sorted list, we can take any column that we want, any sorted column, and we can always just say we want to have the previous element, or for example, -2 elements or +1. So in our first example, wherever we are, we can just say we want the previous row. If we're again in week 13 and we want to have week 12, that's absolutely no problem, because in the sorted column, we can just say, give me 1 element before, so we get the week before. But this approach also works in case of the change of a year. So if we're in week 1 with the offset function, we can also just say, give me the previous element. And like this, we get the element of the week before. And in this case, it doesn't really matter if it's week 52 or 53. It also doesn't really matter that it's a change of years, because in a sorted column, we can easily just say, give me the previous element, and we always will get the proper element. And now, as we know the new approach with the offset function, I want to go a little bit more into details how the function works. In general, I said it works with every column, so it doesn't have to be a dated column. It can be any sorted column. In our case, we can, for example, just take our brand column, and it would also work with a brand column if we sort it. So in general, let's just take the sales amount from our brand column, and let's try to work a little with the offset function. For this, we would create a new measure. I can call it sales. Let's make that a little bigger. Previous brand. And I can now use my calculate to get my measure. I want to say sales amount. And if we wouldn't do anything and just show it in the visual, it would return the same value as our sales amount measure. In general, calculate is just used to change or alter the filter context, and this is what we want to do with the offset function. In order to get now always the previous brand, we want to use the offset function. This means as a calculate modifier, we will use offset. As a first argument, we need the amount of items it has to go back or to the front. So we say we want to have -1 elements, what is the previous element. And then, as I mentioned, we need a sorted and ordered column. So we will say order by, and now we will order it by product brand, and we will order it ascending. And we have to close the offset function. At the moment, autocorrect in the Power BI editor is still underlining it in red, but that is actually wrong. The editor is not updated at the time you watch this video. I hope Microsoft fixed that. But if we click enter, it doesn't throw an error, so the whole thing works. And if we now go back to our report, we also see that the function works. So for example, if we go to AdventureWorks, we see our new measure gives us the 2.2 million from the previous brand. The same, for example, if we go down here to Northwind Traders, we will get the 3.5 million from the previous brand. So with the offset function, let's go back to our formula. With the offset function, we can just change the filter context. In our case, we will get the previous brand because we say -1. So it will go back by one brand. After we understand now how the offset function works, we need to make sure we have a column in our date table that will sort by the correct week. And in order for this to work, we need a week in the ISO format. I quickly want to explain the difference. So we want to compare always whole weeks. For example, we want to also compare week 1 of a year to the last week of the previous year. For this, we need to use the ISO calendar, as the ISO calendar always is producing whole weeks. For example, if we take a look at January 2021, the 1st, 2nd and 3rd of January, they still belong to week 53 of the previous year. So the 1st, 2nd and 3rd of January in the ISO week are still part of week 53 in 2020. And that's actually a good approach because, as I mentioned, we want to compare whole weeks. And with the ISO calendar, we can make sure that there are always whole weeks compared. If we would use, for example, the normal American or Australian calendar, we would have a problem because the first week always starts on January 1st. This means also again for 2021, on January 1st would be a Friday, so the first week would only contain 3 weeks, and the week 53 of 2020 would only contain 4 days. The last week always automatically ends at the last day of the week. But as we want to compare whole weeks, in this case, we definitely have to use our ISO calendar. And for this reason, we have to make sure we have a column that is using the ISO calendar to compare whole weeks with each other. If you don't have proper column that we can use, we can create easily one as a calculated column in Power BI. So you just go to your date table and create a new calculated column. In my case, let's make that a little bigger. I will call it year week, and this should be the combination of the year and the week number. So we can use this as a sorted column for our week over week comparison. In our case, we just need a few variables, or the year of the current row. The year of the current row we can just get with the year of our date. If we want to see how the value would look like, we can just return this value. So we see this on the side here. This would always return the year of the current date. We need to do the same for our month and the week. So month current row would be the month of the current row, as I already said. And then we need the week number. So week current row. And this, as I mentioned, we need the ISO format. For this, we first need our date itself. So date in my case. And then we need to define it at ISO calendar. Usually here the autocorrect is just only giving a 1 or 2 or providing a 1 or 2. But we can use code 21. It also shows it's wrong, but that's actually also right. So if we return that, we would see now the current week in the ISO calendar. To quickly explain that this argument is actually valid, I will quickly go to the DAX guide documentation from our friends from SQL BI. And the return type, it has a complete list here. So we see always the return type 1 or 2 for a week begins on Sunday or Monday. And we also see here the column what system it works. So system 1 is the week containing January 1st, is the first week of the year. And system 2 is the ISO calendar that I just mentioned. So we have to use system 2 in order to get the proper calendar. So we have to use the argument 21 to get the proper ISO calendar and with these full weeks. That's what we did right here. And at the end, we have to calculate because, as I mentioned, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of January, for example, in 2021 would belong to the previous year. So in this case, we have to subtract 1 year from the current year. And this we can do with an easy if. So let's say this is the year return. This we can check if the week of the current row is, let's say, bigger than 50. So it means we're at the end of the year. And the month of the current row equals 1. Then we should return the year of the current row minus 1 and otherwise the year of the current row. So this means if we have a week larger than 50, let's say we would have week 52 or 53, but we're already in January, then it should return the previous year. So it would mean we're at the week 53 of the previous year, and otherwise it should return the current year. At the end, we just have to put everything together. So we will now return our year times 100 plus the week of the current row. And like this, we should get a key that is the combination of our year and our week number by the ISO calendar. And this column we can now use to sort by for our week over week comparison. So now it's more or less the same that we already did with our brand. First, I will display our week, that is now our sorted column. And I will also display the sales amount of the week that is mentioned. And now we want to get the value of the previous week. So we can say sales amount previous week equals, then we do the same approach as before. We do a calculate of our sales amount, but now we have to change the filter context to the previous week. And this we do as mentioned with the offset function. So we say offset of -1 order by, and now we say year week we called it. And also here we want to have the whole thing ascending, and that was already everything we had to do. And now our filter context is changed. For every value here in our table, we will get the value from the previous element. And let's quickly display this here in our table and maybe get rid of the decimal numbers. And as we can see now, let's quickly zoom in. We have here the value from the previous week. And this also works for the next row and so on. So let's go a little further to the change of year. And the nice thing here is it also works for the change of year, because we don't have to create a new key. We can just say by our sorted column, we want to just have the previous element. And like this, we can just in our sorted column get the last element. So this works for any kind of sorted column. As an addition, we could, for example, do a comparison percentage-wise between the 2 weeks. Let's quickly rename this SA previous week and SA to save a little space. And if, for example, now we want to do a week over week comparison, we can create a measure. Let's quickly unfold this so we can see a little more. Week over week in percent. And then we would have to divide our sales amount minus the sales of the previous week. And this we divide by the sales of the previous week. And like this, we will get the difference in percent. Let's quickly change that to percent. And then we see the development from week to week in percentage. So for example, we have now 93. Let's take the first row. We have now here 93,000. And in the previous week, we had 282,000. This means it's a minus of 66%. Or if we take a few weeks later, we have now 214. And the previous week, we had only 187. This means we made 14% more than in the previous week. As you've seen, it's pretty easy to do a week-over-week comparison with the offset function. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay up to date with the upcoming videos, and see you next week.